This is my son's 2008 Denali with a 6.2 engine, and it has broken exhaust bolts as so many do. Keep checking on this problem because there may be a class action lawsuit before this is all over. You will need a flex head 10mm 12-point socket or a regular socket in a universal joint, and you will find that you can reach these bolts much easier with both front wheels off. Here we have started removing some of the bolts. If the last bolt is broken on either side closest to the passenger compartment, you have a real problem. To make matters worse, our bolt was broken off below the aluminum head. There are two ways to fix this: pull the head and drill out the bolt, or use a special bracket that I'll show you later in this video. It would be impossible to drill this out with the head on the vehicle. If you can drop the exhaust from the manifolds, it'll be easier to work on. But the nuts on this vehicle with 150,000 miles were frozen so badly that you would have to heat them, and I didn't want to do that. That would be my last resort. The studs on the left side, shown here, are so long that you would need a deep impact socket and probably an impact universal joint, but there is limited room for that. Good thinking, GM. This oxygen sensor is right in the way of one of the nuts on the right-hand side. Problem after problem. I tried to remove this oxygen sensor with a special socket and it wouldn't budge, and I didn't want to break it, so I'll use another method. Since I couldn't remove the exhaust pipes from the manifolds without doing some damage, or possible damage, I decided to remove all the bolts from both sides to see if I could drop the exhaust pipes with the manifolds still attached. And I did, and you can, but you have to carefully manipulate this as you do it. I did this by myself, but it would be nice to have someone else operate the jack. Use extreme caution doing this so that you don't bend anything. Later, when you go back with the pipes and manifolds, you'll have to carefully jack and wiggle this as it goes up. It tends to bind, and you need to be very cautious. Just one bolt was broken on the passenger side, and I was lucky in that just the head broke off, leaving some thread. I had to clean up the edges of that broken bolt with a die grinder so I could start a nut on it. I was able to double nut this and then back it out with a very thin wrench I had, which worked well. If using two nuts, double nutting this does not remove it, then you have another option that I tried that did work. Find a nut for the outside nut the same size but different threads and start it, and that will really jam it. Now I have both exhaust manifolds loose and there's enough room to work. I wish I could have used this Craftsman stud remover, which works real well, but the stud wasn't long enough to use it. And you can see the broken bolt on the right that is double nutted and jam nutted to remove. Even if you could drill out this broken bolt to use an easy out, I doubt that an easy out would work because GM uses Loctite on these bolts, and I had great difficulty in removing the broken bolt. It's a good idea to clean the heads and the manifold with a putty knife. It's very close, but you can do it, and you can also reach in with a piece of sandpaper and sand the surface of the exhaust manifold. Now, I'm 75 and I've done this my entire life, and I can tell you this. It's very risky to try to drill out an iron stud in an aluminum head, because if you don't get your drill bit centered perfectly and punched properly, it will wander into the aluminum, and you don't want that to happen. Usually, you won't get but one chance to center punch that broken stud correctly. If your drill bit wanders from that center punch, it's really hard to correct. This shows a passenger side oxygen sensor, And like I said, I didn't want to ruin an oxygen sensor. I could not get this sensor to budge. I slid a box end wrench over this oxygen sensor wire and used a pipe over the wrench with extreme force, but not enough to break it off, and it still wouldn't budge. So if you can't drop this exhaust without doing damage, just drop it with both exhaust manifolds still attached. It'll go just as well. On the driver's side, there were 2 broken bolts. One I could get to, and the other one, like I said previously, was at the end of the head where it would be impossible to get to. Here's another view of that stud remover, which I couldn't use in this case, and the double nutted broken bolt. I pulled the plugs out to check them. They had never been checked since my son bought this vehicle. And wear is not all that obvious on these iridium plugs. You just have to use a feeler gauge to see how much was burned away. And there was enough to justify replacing the plugs, plus having them out of the way you wouldn't break one. Look at your plug wires while you have them off. You can see here that the strand of graphite impregnated fiber is not burnt. It looks fine. Check both ends of your plug wires as you see here and make sure that they're not burned, that they're okay. I have a video on my YouTube channel that tells how to remove really stuck plug wire boots. This is something you have to be really careful about. These GM vehicles have metal shields over the plug wires, so you're not able to use WD-40 or something like that on the plug wires to try to break them loose from the plug insulator. If you will be patient and twist these back and forth, not pulling, but just back and forth, eventually it will break loose and turn completely, then you can pull it off without damage. I did not damage any of these wires. Now here is the broken bolt on the driver's side, and as you see here, the coolant temperature sensor is very close to that broken bolt. I was lucky on this side in that the bolt had broken off even, and I didn't have to clean up the edges on it to double nut it. And I did double nut it, tried several times, even heated it with a torch carefully, and I could not get that to break loose. If you use heat, you'll have to use precautions, and you'll see that in a minute. This photo just shows how easy it is to pull that exhaust manifold back away from the head, and there is room to work. These are 12-point ARP bolts, and they're not cheap. Find 2 nuts that'll screw on these ARP bolts, and then use those 2 nuts, of course, on your broken bolt, the remainder of the broken bolt. Here I was able to find a thinner nut for the inside closest to the head nut, which makes it go a little bit better, gives you a little bit more grip on what is left of the threads. So I double nutted this broken bolt and tried several times, and it just wouldn't pull it out. And I even used another nut, the outside nut with different threads. That didn't work either. If the nuts line up when jammed together, you can use a socket over both of them. If not, you'll have to use an open-end wrench. Although my son did not hear an exhaust leak, you can see by these gaskets they were leaking slightly around the end that had the broken bolt. Okay, we'll try something different. Making a heat shield out of some aluminum flashing. I heated that when it was double nutted. I heated it with a propane torch using MAP gas, and it still would not pull it out. So that leaves us with the last resort, and that is to weld the nut to the broken part of the bolt. When welding on a car with a lot of electronics, you want to make sure you have a good solid ground, clean ground, as close to where you're welding as possible. There is an unused bolt hole in the head above the exhaust, and I used that clean new bolt in the head for a ground for my welder. Now the wire welder I have is small, and I didn't want to trust welding that with a wire welder. Instead, I used my Lincoln stick welder at 110 amps. Be very careful doing this. Make sure your electrode doesn't touch anything but the stud and the nuts. And if you have welding blankets, which I don't, you need to use them right now. And the last resort without pulling the head worked. The heat softened that Loctite, which I said was very good Loctite that GM uses. This heats up that Loctite and lets you extract that broken bolt. The bolt I removed from the passenger side was so tight that even double nutted, I was able to remove it, but it was so tight, it was very difficult. That's how good that Loctite is. I'm sure there's other brands of gasket like Felpro and Victor that are just as good, but we chose to go back with the original Delco gaskets. I believe these are stainless steel, and let me warn you, they are sharp as a razor. There's markings on this that indicate manifold side and down, so be sure and look for that. Here you can see I used a piece of 2x4 to block that away to where I could get my hand in there to make sure the head and the exhaust manifold was as clean as I could get it before installing the new gaskets. Here I've installed the gaskets, and yes, you can do it without bending them. You have to finagle a little bit, but they will go in there. And shown here is a longer stud I used to line up that manifold to where I could start a couple of the bolts in it. You can also use that bolt I screwed into the head for a welding ground to use a pry bar to manipulate that exhaust manifold back and forth to start your bolt. The long stud shown here on the right that has a little red end on it lined that manifold up to where I could start all of my bolts. This red wire was a ground wire but not grounded, so I grounded it. These ARP bolts are going to require a 10 millimeter 12-point socket, so some of those can be reached easier through the fender well. That's the reason I recommended taking the two front wheels off. But none of them are that hard to reach with a universal joint and an extension. And another view of the installed bolts. These ARP bolts are available from Summit and many other places. I'm a Prime member with Amazon and I love it, and I used Amazon for all my parts. Now for the problem on the end bolt that I was not able to get to on the left side, driver's side, closest to the passenger compartment. I told my son that I could fabricate a bracket to put pressure on the exhaust manifold where the bolt was broken off by using the two holes in the back of the head. However, after my son did some research, he found out that the bracket has already been made. So isn't that something? I at least had a good idea. You can pattern a bracket if you want to try to make one from the two holes on the right head front, because they're the same as the left rear. So I found one quickly at Amazon. And this can save you from pulling the cylinder head. You might not be able to read this, so I'll read it for you. If you need the ring gasket between the manifold and the pipe, that's Felpro 61089. The AC Delco gaskets are $12.08, and that is a piece. And the number is 126-17944. And the AC Delco plugs are 41-110. The ARP part number is 134-1202. One other thing my son wanted me to do while I was working on this, and it looked like it had never been done before, and that is to clean the air valve, the throttle body. First step is to pry that threaded plastic stud down. Put a screwdriver between the bracket around the hose and the bracket on the air cleaner and separate those. Remove the plastic cover from the top of the intake, and it snaps down on these ball studs you see sticking up. Lift up and pull forward. Loosen the clamp around the throttle body, and you can see that this clamp has a little indentation that goes a certain way. This drive-by-wire vehicle, you can open this throttle valve with no problem and block it open with a wooden block at the bottom first. And you can use a toothbrush and some WD-40 or solvent and make sure that you get the throttle blade clean on both sides. Now use a wooden block on the top part to hold it open, and then you can clean the bottom part of the air body. Cleaning the throttle body may improve your idle. And this is a closer look at the ball studs that holds that top cover over the intake manifold. Well, another hard day for this old man. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope it'll help you. See ya.